I had a recipe for shrimp sauce, for shrimp cocktail, for entertaining, and it called for 1/4 cup of horseradish. You couldn't get horseradish there, so I had brought back from Canada some dehydrated stuff, very strong and concentrated, so I just gave the recipe to my cook because she could read English and was very good. However, she proceeded to put 1/4 cup of the concentrate into it, so we all sat down for dinner, and I was quite unaware of this, and we all started eating it. We were all sitting there with tears rolling down out of our eyes, when one of the Korean guests said, "I always thought Canadians didn't like hot, spicy foods." Anyway, they all ate it and seemed to enjoy it, and as for us, well, it really cleared our sinuses out. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian, and today we're talking about Sandra Stahl's The Personal Narrative as Folklore. This is a good example of how to locate an article in history. Because at this time, now, well into the 21st century, the points that she is making in this article have been so absorbed into the study of folklore and how folklore is understood that it's almost difficult for us to remember that there was an argument that needed to be made. So this article, as the title suggests, is Stahl's argument. She goes by Dolby now, but at the time she went by Sandra Stahl, and her presumably, and again, this is a little bit of subtextual reading, but fundamentally she had recognized as a graduate student that there is this practice that we do that is meaningful, that is important, that is folkloric, that is traditional, and that is the telling of our own stories, our own experiences, communicating how we see the world, in part not by reiterating the narratives that have been passed down to us, but by creating our own narratives, and that is a traditional act. And you can imagine that at one point there was those gatekeepers of tradition, the generation before, basically said, no, that is not the case. That is not an object of inquiry suitable for a folklorist. And so she rolled up her sleeves and basically said, all right, I will use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, and I will show you how this is in keeping with everything that we have been saying about folklore up to this time. So she just systematically dismantles the counter-argument about why this thing is an inappropriate subject for the folklorist's study, and instead just demonstrates that this is not simply parallel to what folklorists have traditionally studied, but this is fundamentally recognizable, even if they are not using the word folklore, recognizable part of the expressive, artistic, communicative culture of peoples throughout Indiana, throughout North America, throughout the world. That this is something that we do. All the stuff that you hear nowadays about the role of narrative, I'm not saying that she is square one, but I'm saying is that the world is catching up to what she is saying in this article. That it is about that orientation between the self and the collective, the present and the past, the specific and the general. All of these things are clustered in the personal experience narrative. At this point, she was still using the word personal narrative, but personal experience narrative is basically the term of art now, and sometimes you'll see them abbreviated to PEN. So one of the first things she does, she talks about tradition. She tries to demonstrate that once you move away from tradition as being a thing that exists outside of the flow of human interaction, and therefore thinking of it purely as items, you start to see how the personal experience narrative flows in. Now, the people that she's addressing are in part the old fogies, and in part this new generation, the generation that might be like sort of half a generation before her, like the folklorist of the late 60s and early 70s, while she's a folklorist of the mid 70s. I know those distinctions might be very fine, but I think that they are basically appropriate. So she is talking to the Alan Dundases and the Robert Georges and the Richard Baumans and so on, and she's just, I mean, basically, they have just emerged out of their graduate programs and are starting this, and Roger Abrams, and they're starting the new disciplinary conversation, and she is in that first flush of people who are taking those things and saying yes and, or yes but. It's a sort of, is it the improvisatory Del Himes? I meant Del Close, but Del Himes is mentioned in this way. Is that improvisatory building on something, the yes and, or is it the sed contra est of the quaestio? And so basically she's saying, because they were sort of dismantling the idea of tradition entirely. There's no such thing as tradition. And it's like, yeah, well, there's no such thing as these artifacts that exist outside of human culture. But at the very least, the prefabricated texts that we often go back to, or the pre-formulated texts, I should say, there is precedent. And the fact that there is precedent is not irrelevant. And so once we have, in a way, moved all the way past the idea of tradition being a thing, we need to bring it back. And another reason is that the folk themselves understand certain practices as being part of a cultural inheritance in terms of, perhaps a repertoire of narratives, but also, so a repertoire of narratives and then a cultural inheritance and a kind of practice, cultural inheritance. We want to think, and one of the things that she sort of unpacks is the difference between stories and kinds of storytelling. And so, and she's not even talking about genres, but she's saying that the practice of coming together and telling stories are the traditional practice, whether or not they are the reperformance of collective narratives, collectively understood narratives, and narratives that are not wholly the domain of the individual and because it is of their personal experience. So Märchen being the classic example. Contemporary legend sort of works in that way as well. So they could be telling those stories, or they could be telling their own stories. So she dismantles tradition in this lovely way, because tradition is always, even the most staunch traditionalists recognize that in performance innovation happened. And so you always want to be thinking in terms of the tension between tradition and innovation. And that, so first thing, those are always going to be in play. And then there's going to be genres that are much more about keeping the, I want to remind us that intention is important. So it is a matter of there are performance contexts where the desire is such within the performer, within the expectations of the audience, to adhere to precedent as much as possible, to the point of that is one of the aesthetic criteria. How much do they, in this performance, does it cleave to previous performances? And then there are spheres of activity, performance contexts, performance genres, expectations, where fundamentally innovation is what is valued, or at the very least, the impetus towards cleaving to precedent is not nearly as strict as it was before. And so, even within a particular culture, there are these, there are certain forms where we are hoping for conservative, and there are certain forms we're hoping for dynamic. She makes an argument, she points to one of Henry Glassey's articles. I think it's in the when she's referring to Night Train to Selma. And and, or I mean, maybe she's talking, I can't remember, I can look it up, but I'm not going to. The idea that even within the same community, when they are doing certain forms of folk song, they favor the traditional. They favor it being very similar to how it has gone before. And when they are engaged in particular storytelling, they love improvisation, they love variation, they love exaggeration, and so on. And so it's not like people are conservative or dynamic. It is people attribute values of conservatism to some genres and dynamism to others. So anyway, so tradition is always a relative quality, and tradition is not exclusively the domain of the individual analyst saying this is a traditional act and this is not, but it's it is a negotiation, and we're always sort of talking about when does something become traditional, and you can make arbitrary discussions, arbitrary decisions, and it's like, oh, it needs to be around for a generation, or at the very least it needs to have demonstrably be replicated. It has to have undergone some form of transmission, usually performed by a second performer, whatever you want to say. My argument is always that fundamentally, once a decision to do something is based in part on a precedent of something that went vaguely before it with intention or not, there is, at least you can make the argument for tradition, and the participants themselves can make the argument for tradition. Moving away from narrative very quickly, if at the beginning of the semester, after a class, you say you want to go grab a coffee, and you do so, and then the next week it's like, almost without thinking, it's like, coffee, and you're doing so, all of a sudden you are beginning the initial stages of a custom that might just be between you and a new classmate, but like, this is what you do, and one of the reasons you do it is that this is how you cater your week, and this is how you this is what you do. I mean, so much of folklore is, well, this is what you do. It's not non-reflective in terms of one can't think about it, or that one does it unconsciously. It's just that one doesn't necessarily spend a huge amount of time analyzing the motives for it, because it doesn't necessarily need to be held up to scrutiny, because it is about lived experience. So anyway, now it is obvious. It's obvious that on the level of texts, on the level of plots, and of the specific plots, the personal experience narrative cannot be traditional in that sense, because it is expressly intended to be a communicative act that is trying to relay a message, coding and encoding and for eventual decoding a message, to use George's terms, of an experience that is being presented as having occurred to the narrator. The narrator and the protagonist are basically one and the same. In fact, they are meant to be one and the same, and it is something that is a wholly unique moment of space and time that is now being related into a story. So how can it be traditional? It's like, okay, well, with the exception of plot, which, this is a new thing. This is a new, unprecedented story because it is an experience that has never been given voice before. But first of all, it might be a type of experience that is being given voice to before. And because it is a type of experience that has been given voice to before, your narrative of it might be conforming to that type. A good example is work done by, why am I blanking on her name? What a dreadful person I am. I will be putting it on the bottom of the screen. But things like coming out narratives, narratives of LGBTQ people who have, as part of their personal experience narrative repertoire, a point that she's going to get to later, so I'll point that out, a version of a story that is intensely real. It is fundamental. It is primary. It is about their identity. And it is something that they can communicate to other people. And the narrative is going to be reminiscent, not in some kind of disingenuous sense, but reminiscent of other coming out narratives, at the very least to the point of they are going to have sort of functional equivalences, so you can participate in a moment where everyone is sharing their stories, and B, it's recognized as a genre in and of itself. So it has that kind of precedent. So it is traditional, and fundamentally it has to do with the arc of narrative itself. There's also these moments where we're talking about the tradition in terms of form, where experiences become reformulated, recoded and encoded, in part because we know the expectations of narrative, and that if narrative is, as we're always discussing when we talk about oral literature, if narrative is in part an understanding of form and an understanding of what makes an effective and an affective narrative, something that delights and compels as much as it communicates information, we know how to shape our narrative, whether on the level of tone of voice or of gesture, but also in terms of maybe fudging a detail or two, which isn't necessarily an untruth, but it might be a matter of making for a more compelling narrative, and we have an understanding of those narratives. We have an understanding of what makes for a good story, and so when we go into the realm of speaking of personal experience and putting it into narrative form, and not simply the telling of the personal experience, but the retelling of the personal experience, to the point where it hits the level of, do you want to use the word anecdote? Sure. Anecdote's a kind of weird, fuzzy term, but it's a common enough term, so we might as well employ it every now and then. If you have this thing that you can whip out at a party, when it is relevant, when it is important, it is a story that you have polished to an extent, and it might be something that people recognize as something that they want to hear. You got to tell this story again. And it is even framed as story. It isn't all personal experience in terms of give me your testimony. This has entered into that just additional level of something that is a piece of verbal art that I, as audience member, recognize you as teller, telling in such a way that I wish to experience vicariously through this third party what it was like to hear it for the first time. Please, you have to tell Gertrude your story, because Gertrude, you've got to listen to this story. And what I will do the whole time, I'll be like, huh? Because not only is it a great experience, not only is Gertrude finding out a lot about Shirley, but I'm just reveling in the artistry of it. So, and we see these. Now, not all personal experience narrative is entertainment. Of course, I don't think coming out narratives are entertainment. I think coming out narratives become shaped in a way that, because they often have purpose. One of the things that she talks about is the idea that they have these sort of story cores to them, and these culturally relevant attitudes that are at the bottom of these. That we don't tell them simply to relay experience, and that often the experience of the specific is as much about communicating and sharing and commiserating with to and with others similar worldview. So when because you want to think of these things, you want to think of these things as happening within a process, because when do these stories emerge? So when you tell of an experience that is perhaps and at least discombobulating, and it seems to demand some kind of reassurance, or at least some kind of settling of the uncertainty that the story might suggest, rather than merely give reassurances, although we should always be reassuring those we love. You can also, or I, in this hypothetical scenario, can also relate a relevant personal narrative that A, communicates that your experience, however unique, is not distinct, is not however distinct is not unique. However alone you might feel in that experience, there are others like it that are not to negate what you have done, but to let you know that you are not alone in that. They might be more distanced in time, and they might be therefore benefit from my level of wisdom or my level of resignation to the nature of the world, to the worldview that is being communicated through it. And then I might tell my story, and then another person might tell her story. Shirley might tell her story, no longer for entertainment for Gertrude, but for something more profound. And so on, and so on. And so these personal experiences are part of the larger project of reaffirming worldview. Now, I was giving very positive and very warm and very fuzzy reassurances, and clearly the same thing happens within worldviews that we might not particularly I'm just going to erase that subjunctive with worldviews that we find abhorrent, and that the same kind of process can take place in misogynist circles and homophobic circles and in racist circles as well, where we will hear some kind of narrative and another kind of narrative will follow suit, another kind, and then we re-entrench these attitudes of divisiveness as well. So I don't want you thinking that the study of personal experience narrative is inherently a positive, warm and fuzzy thing, but it does provide, and what it has done and how it has revolutionized folklore is that fundamentally it provides the pool of data, a cold way of saying it, but a pool of data that within the realm of story and within the realm of storytelling and that quasi-functional role that storytelling has in sharing, where it's not simply for entertainment. We might have stories that conform to the expectations of what constitutes a good story, so there is an aesthetic value of them. But there, as much more than anything, the aesthetic value is about its relevancy and how I have laid out more clearly the implicit, sometimes made explicit, but at the very least the implicit lesson that I wish to impart through telling it. So if we get these stories, we can fundamentally take the temperature of the group, and we can fundamentally come to grasp those attitudes that might be positive or that might be tragic but are potentially emancipatory if they are unpacked, like the narratives of people undergoing violence or undergoing oppression. We hear these stories, and in sort of a James Scott weapons of the weak situation, we can these are things that are regularly being expressed, and they're being expressed in these very modest, very humble ways through narrative, but they're clearly objects of concern. They're clearly moments of concern, and we can take those and we can build insight into them. Or we can look at groups that, again, aren't necessarily morally repugnant, but might be doing something that we have severe issues with. For example, Andrea Kita's work on anti-vaccination movements. And it's like we listen to not simply their rationale, their quasi-scientific rationale, and we can easily dismiss it as, this is folly. If we listen to their narratives, doesn't mean that we are embracing their their quasi-scientific rationale. But what we are doing is we are understanding the worldview that gives rise to a a lack of trust in the medical system, so much so that real science becomes rejected in that world. And so that's the thing that you need to address. You don't just point out why their science is bad. You begin with the recognition that it is not the work of foolish actors. It is the work of perhaps desperate actors, but not fools. So personal experience narrative just becomes this moment that allows one to enter into it. And so once Stahl, more or less, I'm going to say single-handedly, but this is the sort of the lead-off of a special issue of, was it called Journal of Folklore Research at the time, or I can't remember. That's the same journal. The sort of like, this is the Journal of American Folklore, and the whatever it was called. It's now called the Journal of Folklore Research, but it's kind of like the dry for show and the putt for dough. This is the putt for dough journal. And it's a special issue on basically, ta-da, MFers, we are dropping the personal experience narrative as a recognized and viable area of folklore research. Everything fundamentally has shifted since that time. And so as awesome as the study of Märchen is, and I will defend the study of Märchen from anyone who dismisses it as mere children's literature or old-fashioned or even nationalism, although all those things are in place. The study of personal experience narrative, which builds on the insights that are had in the study of Märchen and the nature of story and the nature of what constitutes variation and the nature of innovation versus tradition and all these things. When you start talking about personal experience narrative, you start talking about people who are not simply creative in how they take the remnants of their culture and recombine them, but they're creative in taking the remnants of their culture and adding to it by communicating their own experience. And by doing so, providing that data for understanding things better. That, my friends, is why you study folklore to begin with. Stories is cool, but this is the sociological fodder. This is, if you want to be crass, this is the data for understanding human complexity at its most complex, because it is typically at its most non-reflective. It is typically at its most vulnerable. It is typically, in many ways, beginning from a position of trying to sort out between what is certain and what is ambiguous. And that's why you study narrative. I haven't really given much of a point-by-point breakdown of this article because I think it's a wonderful article that more or less speaks for itself. But please, in the name of all that is holy, read Sandra Stahl's personal narrative as folklore. It is necessary. It's necessary not simply for the study of folklore. It is necessary. I don't have anything else to say. As always, I wish you well, my friends.